In a kingdom filled with towering castles, lush gardens, and bustling streets, the royal guards were known as the silent protectors of peace. They stood tall and proud, their armor gleaming under the sunlight, their faces stern and unreadable. These men and women were trained not just to fight but to embody strength, loyalty, and discipline. To show emotion was considered a weakness, and breaking character could mean losing respect, or worse, endangering the very people they swore to protect. Captain Alden was one of the most respected members of the Royal Guard. He had earned his position through years of hard work and unwavering dedication. His posture was always perfect, his voice steady, and his expressions carefully controlled. People often whispered about how he seemed almost untouchable, like a statue carved from stone. But behind those sharp eyes lay a man who had seen more than most could imagine, a man who carried secrets buried deep within him. Every day, the palace gates welcomed visitors from all walks of life. Merchants came to sell their goods, nobles arrived for courtly affairs, and sometimes ordinary citizens sought help or guidance. Among these visitors were elderly folks who traveled long distances, hoping to share their concerns with someone in power. Many of them approached the guards, thinking they might find sympathy or assistance. However, the guards were instructed to remain distant, redirecting such matters to higher authorities. Alden followed this rule without question. He believed that maintaining order meant keeping emotions at bay. Yet there were moments when something stirred inside him, perhaps a flicker of curiosity or a pang of guilt. When he saw frail hands clutching worn-out letters or heard trembling voices pleading for mercy. Still, he reminded himself of his duty and pushed those feelings aside. One sunny afternoon, as Alden stood guard near the main entrance, a small crowd gathered outside the gates. Most were villagers bringing petitions, but one figure caught his attention. An elderly woman shuffled forward, leaning heavily on a wooden cane. Her clothes were simple yet clean, and her silver hair framed a face lined with age and hardship. She looked up at the guards with a mixture of determination and exhaustion. Something about her presence felt familiar, though Alden couldn't quite place it. The other guards around him exchanged glances, unsure whether to let her pass. The woman didn't seem threatening, but protocol dictated that only authorized individuals could enter the palace grounds. As Alden stepped closer to assess the situation, his heart skipped a beat. There was something in her eyes, kindness mixed with sadness, that struck a chord deep within him. For a brief moment, his rigid stance faltered, and his mind wandered back to memories he thought he had forgotten. He quickly composed himself, reminding his fellow guards that rules were rules. But as the woman waited patiently, clutching a small bundle close to her chest, Alden couldn't shake off the strange sensation growing inside him. Who was she? And why did she feel so familiar? Little did he know, this encounter would change everything. Not just for him, but for everyone who witnessed what happened next. The elderly woman stood at the palace gates, her frail hands gripping the wooden cane tightly. She looked around nervously, as if unsure whether she was in the right place or if she even belonged there. Her eyes scanned the guards standing tall and imposing before her, their armor gleaming under the sunlight. For a moment, it seemed like she might turn back, overwhelmed by the grandeur of the palace and the stern expressions of its protectors. But then, with a deep breath, she took another step forward. Captain Alden watched her intently. Something about her demeanor tugged at his memory, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why. The way she held herself, her quiet determination mixed with an air of vulnerability, felt oddly familiar. It wasn't until she lifted her head slightly, revealing more of her face, that recognition struck him like a bolt of lightning. His breath hitched involuntarily, and for a split second, his usually stoic expression faltered. "Malus," he whispered, so softly that only those closest to him could hear. Her eyes widened in disbelief, and she froze, staring at him as if trying to confirm what she had just heard. Then, slowly, her lips parted into a trembling smile. "Alden," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Tears began welling up in her tired eyes, and her grip on the cane loosened. If not for Alden instinctively stepping forward to steady her, she might have stumbled. The other guards exchanged uneasy glances. They had never seen their captain act this way before. Captain Alden was known for his unshakable composure, his ability to remain calm and collected no matter the situation. Yet here he was visibly shaken, speaking to an elderly woman with a familiarity that defied protocol. No one dared say anything, but the tension in the air was palpable. Melis clutched the small bundle closer to her chest, her gaze fixed on Alden as if afraid he might disappear again. "It's really you," she murmured, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "I never thought I'd see you again." Alden felt a lump rise in his throat. He wanted to respond, to tell her how much he had missed her, but words failed him. Instead, he removed his helmet, revealing his face fully for the first time in years while on duty. The action drew sharp intakes of breath from the other guards, who were now watching the scene unfold with growing unease. Breaking character like this was unheard of, especially for someone in Alden's position. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Melis reached out hesitantly, her hand trembling as she touched his arm. "You've grown so much," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "But you still look the same. Those eyes." Alden swallowed hard, struggling to maintain his composure. Memories flooded back, images of a simpler time when life wasn't burdened by duty and responsibility. He remembered Melis sitting by the fire at the orphanage where he grew up, mending clothes and telling stories. She had been kind and patient, treating every child as if they were her own. When she disappeared without explanation, it left a void in his young heart that he had tried to fill ever since. "I thought you were gone," Alden finally managed to say, his voice cracking slightly. "What happened to you?" Melis lowered her gaze, guilt flashing across her face. "Life took me away," she admitted quietly. "Things got complicated. I had no choice but to leave." Before she could explain further, Alden noticed the bundle in her arms. It was wrapped in faded cloth, worn from years of use. Curiosity mingled with concern as he asked, "What is that? What are you carrying?" She hesitated, clutching the bundle tighter. "It's something important," she said, her voice tinged with both sadness and urgency. "Something I need your help with." The weight of her words hung heavy in the air. Alden glanced at the other guards, who were still watching silently. He knew he should redirect her to the proper authorities, but something stopped him. This was Melis, the woman who had cared for him when no one else did. Whatever she needed, he owed it to her to listen. And so, against all rules and expectations, Alden made a decision that would change everything, not just for himself, but for everyone involved. Alden's mind raced as he stood there, his helmet tucked under one arm, and his usual armor of stoicism beginning to crack. He knew the eyes of his fellow guards were on him, their confusion and unease almost palpable in the air. Yet, none of that mattered now. Melis was here, real, alive, and standing before him after so many years. The woman who had once been a beacon of kindness during his darkest days needed something from him, and he couldn't turn away. Melis shifted uncomfortably, clearly aware of the attention they were drawing. "I shouldn't have come," she muttered, her voice trembling. She glanced at the bundle in her arms, then back at Alden, her expression torn between desperation and regret. "This isn't right. I'm sorry." "No," Alden said firmly, surprising even himself with the conviction in his voice. He stepped closer, lowering his tone so only she could hear. "You're not leaving until you tell me what this is about." His words were gentle but firm, a stark contrast to the authoritative commands he usually issued as captain. The other guards exchanged uneasy glances. One of them, a younger recruit named Torin, cleared his throat nervously. "Captain," he ventured, his voice hesitant, "is everything all right?" Alden turned slightly, meeting Torin's gaze. For a moment, he considered brushing off the question or redirecting Melis to someone else, but something stopped him. Perhaps it was the way Melis clutched the bundle, as though it contained the weight of the world. Or maybe it was the look in her eyes, a mixture of fear, hope, and exhaustion, that made him realize this wasn't just another routine visitor seeking help. This was personal. "I'll handle this," Alden said simply, his tone leaving no room for argument. The other guards nodded reluctantly, though their expressions remained uneasy. They had never seen their captain act this way before. Normally, Alden would have sent someone like Melis straight to the palace steward, or instructed her to submit a formal request. But today, rules seemed to fade into the background. Melis watched the exchange silently, her hand still gripping the bundle tightly. When Alden turned back to her, she gave him a small, grateful smile. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I didn't think anyone would care." Alden frowned, feeling a pang of guilt. "Of course I care," he replied softly. "You cared for me when no one else did. That means something." Her eyes glistened with fresh tears, but she quickly blinked them away. Taking a deep breath, she held out the bundle toward him. "It's why I came," she explained, her voice steadier now. "This belongs to someone important, to both of us, and I need your help to make things right." Alden hesitated, unsure whether to take the bundle or ask more questions. Before he could decide, Melis continued, her voice filled with urgency. "Do you remember Kellen?" she asked, her eyes searching his face for any sign of recognition. The name hit Alden like a punch to the chest. Of course he remembered Kellen, his younger brother, the boy who had shared his bed, his meals, and his laughter at the orphanage. Kellen, who had disappeared without a trace years ago, leaving behind only unanswered questions and sleepless nights. Alden had spent countless hours wondering what had happened to him, hoping against hope that he was safe somewhere. "I remember him," Alden said finally, his voice tight with emotion. "But what does he have to do with this?" Melis opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, a commotion erupted near the palace gates. A group of merchants trying to enter had grown impatient, their raised voices drawing the attention of nearby guards. Alden instinctively straightened, his training kicking in as he prepared to restore order. But Melis placed a gentle hand on his arm, stopping him. "Please," she pleaded, her voice soft but insistent. "Not here. Let's go somewhere quiet where we can talk." For a moment, Alden wavered. Bringing Melis inside the palace grounds went against every rule he had sworn to uphold. Yet, looking into her tear-filled eyes, he realized that following protocol wouldn't solve anything this time. Whatever she carried in that bundle, and whatever story she had to tell, it deserved his full attention. With a nod, Alden signaled to Torin and the others to maintain their posts. Then, ignoring the weight of tradition pressing down on him, he guided Melis through the gates and toward a secluded courtyard within the palace walls. As they walked, the whispers of the other guards followed them, mingling with the sound of footsteps echoing on stone pathways. For the first time in years, Alden felt uncertain, but also strangely alive, as if he were stepping into uncharted territory where duty and humanity collided. The secluded courtyard was a quiet refuge, far removed from the bustling activity of the palace gates. Sunlight filtered through the leaves of ancient trees, casting dappled shadows on the stone benches and cobblestone paths. It was a place where time seemed to slow down, offering a rare moment of peace in an otherwise chaotic world. Alden led Melis to a shaded bench, his movements deliberate yet gentle. He could feel the weight of her presence, and the bundle she carried, growing heavier with each passing second. "Here," he said softly, gesturing for her to sit. "We can talk here." Melis lowered herself onto the bench, her frail body sagging slightly as if the effort of standing had drained her last reserves of strength. She clutched the bundle tightly in her lap, her fingers tracing its worn fabric absent-mindedly. For a moment, she simply stared at it, her expression unreadable. Then, with a deep sigh, she began to speak. "I've been searching for answers for years," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "Ever since I left the orphanage, I couldn't stop thinking about you and Kellen. I didn't know what happened to either of you after I disappeared, and the guilt. It ate away at me every single day. Alden listened intently, his heart pounding in his chest. He wanted to interrupt, to ask questions, but he forced himself to stay silent. This was her story to tell, and he owed her the patience she had once shown him. When I left, Melis continued, I thought I was doing the right thing. Life at the orphanage had become unbearable. There wasn't enough food, enough money, enough hope. I found work in a distant town, but it came at a cost. I lost touch with everyone I cared about, including you two. And by the time I realized how much I missed you, it was too late. Her voice cracked, and she paused to wipe away tears that had begun to stream down her face. Alden shifted uncomfortably, torn between his training to remain composed and the overwhelming urge to comfort her. In the end, he settled for placing a hand gently on her shoulder, a small gesture, but one that seemed to give her the strength to continue. Years later, she said, taking a shaky breath, I heard rumors about Callan. Someone mentioned seeing a boy who matched his description in a nearby village. I went there, hoping against hope that it was him. But when I arrived, her voice trailed off, and she shook her head sadly. It wasn't Callan. Not exactly. Alden's brow furrowed in confusion. What do you mean? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Melis hesitated, as if unsure how to explain. Then, with trembling hands, she unwrapped the bundle in her lap. Inside was a small, tarnished locket. She opened it carefully, revealing two faded portraits inside, one of Alden as a child, and the other of Callan. The images were unmistakable, though time had dulled their clarity. This belonged to Callan, Melis explained, her voice thick with emotion. I found it in the possession of a trader who claimed he bought it from bandits. They said they'd taken it from a boy who looked just like him. She swallowed hard, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Alden, I think something terrible happened to your brother. The words hit Alden like a hammer blow. His throat tightened, and for a moment, he couldn't breathe. Memories of Callan flooded his mind. Their laughter, their whispered secrets, the promise they'd made to always look out for each other. How many nights had he lain awake wondering where his brother had gone? How many times had he prayed for answers? Do you know what happened to him? Alden managed to ask, his voice hoarse. Melis shook her head, tears spilling freely now. I don't know for sure, she admitted, but the trader mentioned hearing stories about bandits attacking travelers in those parts. If Callan was among them, she couldn't finish the sentence, her grief too raw to put into words. Alden felt the ground shift beneath him. The weight of her revelation threatened to crush him, but he forced himself to stay upright, to keep listening. Why are you telling me this now? He asked, his voice strained. After all these years, Melis looked up at him, her eyes filled with both sorrow and determination. Because I need your help, she said. If there's any chance of finding out what really happened to Callan, if there's any way to bring closure to the pain we've both carried, I can't do it alone. You're the only person I trust to make this right. Her word hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Alden stared at her, his mind racing. He had spent years burying his emotions, locking away the pain of losing his brother. But now, sitting in this quiet courtyard with Melis and the locket that tied them to the past, he realized he couldn't run from it anymore. Whatever lay ahead, he would face it, not just for Callan, but for Melis, who had carried this burden for far too long. The courtyard fell silent as Alden absorbed Melis's words. The locket lay open in her trembling hands, its portraits faded but unmistakable. Each glance at Callan's young face felt like reopening a wound that had never fully healed. For years, Alden had buried his pain beneath layers of duty and discipline, convincing himself that moving forward meant leaving the past behind. But now, confronted with this tangible piece of his brother's life and the haunting possibility of what might have happened to him, he could no longer ignore the ache in his chest. Melis watched him closely, her eyes searching his face for any sign of how he was processing everything. I know this is hard, she said softly, breaking the silence. Believe me, I've carried this guilt and fear for so long. But I couldn't keep it to myself anymore. You deserve to know. Alden nodded slowly, though his jaw tightened as he fought to maintain control. You're right, he admitted, his voice low and strained. I needed to know, but hearing it doesn't make it easier. He reached out hesitantly, taking the locket from her hands. It was lighter than he expected, yet it felt impossibly heavy in his palm. He traced the edges with his thumb, memories flooding back. The sound of Callan's laughter, the way he used to run ahead when they played hide and seek, the promise they made to always protect each other. That promise had weighed on Alden ever since Callan vanished, gnawing at him even as he tried to convince himself that his brother was safe somewhere. I thought I'd find him one day, Alden confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. Even after all these years, I kept hoping. But deep down, he paused, swallowing hard. Deep down, I think I knew something bad happened. I just didn't want to believe it. Melis nodded, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. I understand, she murmured. Hope keeps us going, doesn't it? Even when we know it might hurt more in the end. Alden clenched his fists tightly around the locket, his knuckles whitening. His training had taught him to suppress emotion, to prioritize logic over feelings. Yet here he was, sitting in a quiet courtyard, feeling every ounce of grief and regret he had spent years trying to bury. He wanted to scream, to demand answers from a world that had taken so much from him. But instead, he took a shaky breath, forcing himself to focus. Tell me everything you know, he said finally, his tone firm despite the storm raging inside him. Every detail matters. If there's even a chance of finding out what happened to Callan, or bringing justice, I need to know. Melis wiped her tears and began recounting what little information she had gathered. She described the trader who sold her the locket, the rumors about bandits attacking travelers along remote roads, and the villages she visited in search of clues. Her voice wavered as she spoke, but her determination never faltered. She had traveled far and endured countless hardships to uncover fragments of the truth, driven by the hope of easing the burden she carried. As she spoke, Alden listened intently, piecing together the scattered details in his mind. Though none of it provided definitive answers, it painted a grim picture, one that left little room for optimism. Still, he refused to let despair consume him. Instead, a new resolve began to take shape within him. This wasn't just about Callan anymore. It was about honoring the bond they shared and ensuring that his brother's memory wouldn't fade into obscurity. When Melis finished speaking, she looked up at Alden, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and hope. I don't expect you to forgive me, she said quietly, for leaving, for not being there when you needed me most. But please, help me do this. For Callan. Alden stared at her for a long moment, the weight of her plea settling over him. Then, without hesitation, he placed a hand on hers. We'll figure this out together, he promised, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. Whatever it takes. In that moment, something shifted within Alden. The walls he had built around his heart began to crumble, replaced by a fierce determination to seek justice, not just for Callan, but for Melis, who had sacrificed so much in her quest for answers. As they sat together under the shade of the ancient trees, surrounded by the quiet beauty of the courtyard, Alden realized that true strength wasn't about hiding pain or clinging to duty. It was about facing the past head-on, no matter how painful, and finding a way to move forward, together. Alden's promise to Melis marked the beginning of a journey neither of them could have anticipated. Though the weight of Callan's possible fate loomed heavily over them, Alden felt a strange sense of clarity. For years, he had buried his emotions under layers of duty and discipline. But now, with Melis by his side, he realized that true strength lay not in suppressing pain but in confronting it head-on. Together, they vowed to uncover the truth, no matter how difficult or heartbreaking it might be. The first step was gathering information. Alden knew that as a royal guard, He had access to resources most people didn't: maps, records, and connections across the kingdom. He also knew that working alone would only slow them down. Breaking protocol yet again, he approached two trusted comrades from his unit: Torin, the young recruit who had earlier questioned his actions at the gate, and Captain Lyra, a seasoned officer known for her sharp instincts and unwavering loyalty. Both were surprised when Alden confided in them, explaining the situation with Malus and Kellen. At first, Torin hesitated, unsure whether getting involved was wise. "Captain," he said cautiously, "this isn't exactly standard procedure. What if someone finds out?" Alden met his gaze squarely. "This isn't about procedure," he replied firmly. "It's about doing what's right. If we can bring closure to someone who has suffered for so long, isn't that worth bending the rules?" Torin exchanged a glance with Lyra, who nodded thoughtfully. "He's right," she said. "Sometimes duty means more than following orders. It means protecting those who need it most, even if they're not royalty." With their support secured, the group devised a plan. They divided tasks among themselves, each taking responsibility for different aspects of the investigation. Torin scoured merchant logs and traveler reports, searching for any mention of bandit activity along the routes Malus described. Lyra reached out to informants in nearby villages, leveraging her network to gather leads. Meanwhile, Alden accompanied Malus to revisit the places she had already searched, hoping to find overlooked clues or witnesses willing to share forgotten details. Their efforts quickly drew attention within the palace. Word spread among the guards and staff about Alden's unusual behavior: how he spent hours poring over maps late into the night, how he left the palace grounds frequently with an elderly woman in tow. Some whispered disapprovingly, questioning whether their captain had lost sight of his responsibilities. Others, however, admired his determination and compassion. Even the king took notice, summoning Alden to explain himself. Standing before the throne, Alden braced himself for reprimand. Instead, the king listened intently as Alden recounted Malus's story and their quest for answers. When Alden finished speaking, the king leaned back in his chair, stroking his beard thoughtfully. "You understand this is highly irregular," he said finally, "but I cannot fault you for seeking justice, not when it serves a greater purpose." To everyone's surprise, the king granted Alden permission to continue his investigation, provided it did not interfere with his duties as captain. The gesture was unprecedented, sparking murmurs throughout the palace. Some saw it as proof of Alden's integrity. Others viewed it as a dangerous precedent. Regardless, it gave him the legitimacy he needed to pursue the truth without fear of reprisal. As days turned into weeks, the team uncovered fragments of information that slowly began to form a clearer picture. A villager recalled seeing a group of travelers ambushed by bandits near a desolate stretch of road. A trader mentioned hearing rumors of stolen goods being sold in a distant market. Each lead brought them closer to understanding what might have happened to Kellen, though none offered definitive answers. Through it all, Alden found himself changing. His interactions with Malus softened the edges of his stoic demeanor, revealing a man capable of empathy and vulnerability. He started spending more time listening to elders who visited the palace, offering comfort where he once offered only formalities. Other guards noticed the shift, some inspired to follow his example, while others remained wary of straying too far from tradition. Still, Alden pressed on, driven by a newfound sense of purpose. Whether or not they found Kellen, or the justice he deserved, he knew their efforts mattered. For Malus, for himself, and for every person who believed in the power of compassion over protocol, this journey was about something far greater than duty. It was about humanity. And in embracing that truth, Alden discovered a strength he never knew he possessed. Weeks of relentless searching finally led Alden, Malus, and their small team to a remote village nestled deep within the kingdom's rugged countryside. It was a place few outsiders visited, a quiet, forgotten corner of the realm where life moved at its own pace. The villagers were wary of strangers, but warmed slightly when they saw Alden's royal guard insignia. News of their arrival spread quickly, and soon curious eyes peered from behind cracked doors and weathered fences. One elderly man, his face lined with age and his hands calloused from years of labor, approached them cautiously. "You're looking for something," he said, his voice gravelly but kind. "What is it?" Alden exchanged a glance with Malus before stepping forward. "We're searching for answers about someone who went missing many years ago," he explained. "A boy named Callan. Have you heard anything?" The old man frowned thoughtfully, scratching his chin. Then, after a long pause, he nodded. "There was talk once about travelers being attacked on the eastern road. Bandits took everything they had: gold, supplies, even keepsakes. Some say there were children among them." Malus gasped softly, clutching Alden's arm as if to steady herself. Her knuckles turned white, but she didn't speak. Alden thanked the man and pressed further, asking if anyone had survived or been found afterward. The villager shook his head sadly. "No one came back," he murmured. "But there's an old ruin nearby where the bandits used to camp. Maybe you'll find something there." The group wasted no time heading toward the ruins, their hearts heavy with dread, yet fueled by determination. The site was desolate, overgrown with weeds and littered with broken stones. As they searched, Torin called out suddenly, pointing to a patch of ground that looked disturbed. They dug carefully, uncovering remnants of clothing and personal items half buried in the earth. Among them was a small wooden carving, a crude figure of a bird, unmistakably crafted by inexperienced hands. Malus let out a choked sob. This was his, she whispered, holding the carving tightly. Callan made this when he was little. He always carried it with him. For Alden, the discovery felt like a punch to the gut. The evidence was undeniable now. Callan had indeed fallen victim to the bandits. Though they couldn't confirm exactly what had happened to him, the truth was clear enough to shatter any lingering hope. Malus collapsed to her knees, weeping openly as Alden knelt beside her, wrapping an arm around her trembling shoulders. "I'm so sorry," he murmured, his own voice thick with grief. "I wish I could change it." Malus shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "You gave me answers," she said between sobs. "That's more than I ever expected. Thank you." As the weight of their loss settled over them, the group returned to the village in somber silence. That night, gathered around a flickering fire, they shared stories of Callan, his laughter, his kindness, the way he lit up every room he entered. For the first time, Alden allowed himself to fully grieve, letting the memories wash over him without resistance. His fellow guards listened quietly, moved by the depth of emotion they rarely saw from their captain. Though heartbroken, Malus expressed gratitude for finally knowing the truth. She held the locket close to her chest, vowing to keep Callan's memory alive. "He deserves to be remembered," she said firmly, "not just as a boy who was lost, but as someone who brought joy to everyone he met." In that moment, Alden realized that while justice might remain elusive, love and remembrance could still triumph. Together, they vowed to honor Callan's legacy, not through vengeance, but through acts of kindness and compassion. And though the pain would never fully fade, they found solace in knowing they had done all they could to give Callan the closure he deserved. The days that followed Callan's discovery brought a profound change in Alden. The weight of his brother's fate had left an indelible mark on him, but it also opened doors he never thought possible. For years, he had built walls around himself, believing that showing emotion was a sign of weakness. Now those walls were crumbling, not just for him, but for everyone who witnessed the journey he and Malus had undertaken. Back at the palace, Alden resumed his duties as captain of the royal guard, but something about him was different. He carried himself with the same authority and discipline as before, yet there was a new warmth in his demeanor. Elders visiting the palace no longer felt intimidated by his stern presence. Instead, they found comfort in his willingness to listen. When an old woman approached the gates seeking help for her sick grandson, or a farmer needed assistance retrieving stolen livestock, Alden made sure their concerns were heard, even if it meant bending protocol. His fellow guards noticed the shift as well. At first, some grumbled about how Alden's actions might set a risky precedent. But over time, many began to see the value in what he was doing. Inspired by his example, they started going out of their way to assist villagers and travelers, offering not just protection but kindness. Captain Lyra, in particular, became one of Alden's strongest allies, often reminding others that compassion didn't make them weaker, it made them better. Melis, too, found peace in the aftermath of their search. Though the pain of losing Callan would always linger, she took solace in knowing that his memory lived on through the stories they shared. She stayed in the capital for several weeks after their return, spending her days helping Alden document everything they had learned about Callan's life and legacy. Together, they created a small memorial, a simple wooden plaque engraved with Callan's name and a carving of the bird he loved so much. It was placed in the palace gardens, where sunlight filtered through the trees and birds chirped cheerfully overhead. Word of the memorial spread quickly among the townsfolk, and soon people began leaving flowers and notes beneath it. Some came to pay respects to Callan, while others simply wanted to honor the bond between Alden and Melis. To everyone's surprise, even the king visited the site one quiet morning, standing silently for several minutes before placing a single white rose at its base. As months passed, Alden and Melis grew closer than ever. Their shared grief had forged a connection deeper than words could express. On quieter days, they would sit together in the garden, reminiscing about Callan and sharing stories of their own lives since their paths diverged. Melis eventually decided to return to the village where she had spent much of her later years, promising to write often. Before leaving, she handed Alden a small bundle containing mementos from their childhood, items she had kept all these years as reminders of happier times. "You've given me more than I ever hoped for," she told him, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "Thank you for bringing me back to him, and to you." Alden hugged her tightly, feeling a mix of sadness and gratitude. "We'll always have each other," he promised. "No matter where you go, your family." In the years that followed, Alden continued to lead the royal guard with unwavering dedication, but his leadership style evolved. He encouraged his men and women to embrace moments of humanity, teaching them that true strength lay not in suppressing emotions, but in using them to connect with others. Under his guidance, the guards became known not only as protectors of the realm, but also as compassionate figures who cared deeply for the people they served. And so, the story of Alden, Melis, and Callan became a quiet legend within the kingdom, a tale of loss, love, and redemption. It reminded everyone who heard it that even in the darkest moments, acts of kindness and courage could light the way forward. Through their journey, Alden and Melis ensured that Callan's memory would endure, not as a tragedy, but as a testament to the power of hope, resilience, and the unbreakable bonds of family.